Welcome everybody. Welcome everybody to our webinar this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you're watching it from. We're delighted to see so many of you here today, focusing on retention. What a critically important topic. I mean, always a critically important topic, but even more so today. And we're also delighted that we're going to be joined today by Chris Keating from National Deaf Children's Society. And we'll introduce Chris a bit more formally in just a second as well. For those of you who don't know us, my name is Roger Lawson, and I work with Richard Spencer, and together we are About Loyalty. Richard was formerly at the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, RSPB, and was director of the Commission on the Donor Experience for a couple of years. Some of you will remember that. My background is in charity sector and agency side with Cascade and Good Agency for many years as well. Together, we work to help charities grow the loyalty of their supporters. And by loyalty, we mean that good feeling or that sense of connection that supporters have with charities, and ultimately trying to make supporting a charity a really good experience so that the supporter enjoys it and keeps coming back, and that generate that win-win situation. And we do that through helping charities with strategy, with insight and understanding and audience segmentation, through creating the internal change that is so important. But I think the thing that we're probably best known for is helping charities measure loyalty and measure that emotional commitment that their supporters feel towards them. And by measuring it, then it gives both a benchmark from which to grow it, but also by measuring it, you understand what's driving loyalty for you. So I think that's probably what Rich and I are sort of best known for as About Loyalty on that. Okay. So to introduce the three of us today, I've just introduced really myself and Richard. You're going to hear much more from him than from me this afternoon. And actually, we're delighted that the person we'll hear most from this afternoon is Chris Keating. Chris is Head of Supporter Retention at National Deaf Children's Society. And we're really pleased because he's going to talk about how he's been applying a lot of the measurement to actually grow loyalty and then retention and giving at the National Deaf Children's Society. So what we're going to share with you over the next hour or so, we're going to kick off, actually, we're going to talk a little bit about why retention is so important right now, and what's happening in the world, and we're going to share some of the latest insights from the sentiment tracker that Rich and I have been running weekly to understand how COVID-19 coronavirus is actually impacting your supporters and how they're feeling. And then we're going to talk about what loyalty is, and specifically how to improve it. Richard and Chris are going to talk a lot about that, and then Chris is going to talk about what they've been doing at NDCS and share some results. And then at the end, we'll have an opportunity to answer any questions that you may have. So please do use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, depending on where it is on your screens, but it's on the bottom of mine. Please do use the Q&A, post some questions there if you want to, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible towards the end of this afternoon's webinar. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I hope you find this really useful going forwards, and without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Richard.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Roger. Brilliant. I'm very excited to see so many people here from, literally all over the world. So absolutely brilliant. So first of all, an update on the impacts of COVID-19. Now, our last webinar we held on June the 4th, which, I don't know, depending on how you look at that, it could feel like a very long time ago or merely like yesterday. It kind of depends on the frame of mind that we're in. But what I want to do, I know that not everybody who's here today was with us on June the 4th, but I'm going to use June the 4th or around the start of June as a reference point, just to have a think about, well, what's changed in the last couple of months, and just run through some of the things that have changed. It's important context. So first of all, we're going to look a little bit about some of the news headlines, and I would ask that you don't look at these as an indication of my media consumption habits. That's all I'll say on the matter. But anyway, this is a selection from that I've pulled off from the internet. So some things that have happened since June the 4th. Dominic Cummings, news about the impacts, the sort of indirect impacts on the health service. Warnings of a second wave, and at that point, that was just sort of early June. UK virus death toll reached 50,000. There were Black Lives Matter protests. There was statue toppling. And then we heard that the virus was in retreat. And Boris, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, said, "Yep, it's time to start spending." So kind of attention, and certainly in the media, very much turned towards, yeah, let's get the economy back on an even footing. People were talking about going on holiday from July the 4th. Things were moving forward really quite quickly. And there was that, I don't know if people remember, that there was back in sort of late June, when there were all those pictures in the media of people thronging on the beaches. And again, further from the Prime Minister and the government to say we want more cash, more incentives to get people out on the high streets and shopping. Then early July, there was the first local lockdown. There's kind of a bit of a break in the UK for us, just a little bit. And then also we saw many jobs being announced, job losses being announced across the high street, as the impacts were really starting to hit home in some parts of the UK. Then again, we swung back to some good news, and the headlines here were holidays saved, and the UK was announcing air bridges between with certain countries where people wouldn't have to quarantine when returning from holiday. So what we're seeing here, there's kind of lots of kind of progress and good news, and then followed rapidly by kind of warnings about the virus and the economy. And in the UK, we had on July the 4th was something called Super Saturday. So I'm just looking at one of the questions here, and we'll say those for later, but I just got a little bit distracted by it. Very amusing. So anyway, Boris, don't be reckless on Super Saturday was the headline from the Daily Express. Yeah, Super Saturday was when all the pubs were going to be open again. So there was this kind of this ebb and flow of get people out and then sort of fear for the economy, fear for the virus. And then there were more high street job losses. We then moved on forwards and said, right, okay, face masks compulsory in shops, but a third won't be back in their offices by Christmas. But what we'll do is we'll axe, or according to the Evening Standard, work from home advice. So there's just lots of changes, almost daily. Then there was some hope, a vaccine by Christmas, but the virus was then bringing new holiday misery as some of those countries that were originally on the air bridges, well, actually it's just Spain at this stage, but many discussions about will there be more. So all those people who'd had that kind of their holiday in Spain dangled as a kind of an incentive before them, and maybe had it just whipped away at the last minute. Moving towards just this last week now, further restrictions, certainly in the north of England. Obviously the media calling it new lockdown. Is it lockdown? Not really, but it certainly feels like that in lots of places. And finally, this was from just last Sunday, and for me this summed up really the last week, which was virus fears put lives back on hold. So as you can see, over this last couple of months, we've really had it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride of good news, bad news, indifferent news, and yeah, just a kind of a real mix. So over this period, and in fact since March the 19th, we've been doing a weekly research into the general public and how they're feeling about all this that you're seeing, how it's impacting their emotional state, how they feel about charities and charity giving, just in order so that we can really understand how best charities can talk to people, support people, work with people through what is a very difficult time for so many. And so I'm just going to share with you some of the things that have changed since June the 4th. So around that June time, if you remember, May the 18th was when that first announcement from the Prime Minister around easing of restrictions. So June the 4th was really only just after then. We were kind of moving out of that first lockdown. And what I'm just fascinated by some of these stats. So at the time, we asked the question about how much do people agree with these statements, and we've got about 30% of people agreeing with, yes, we should definitely start to relax some restrictions, but then about just over half saying we should keep the current restrictions in place. So definitely in favour of keeping restrictions. And in fact, well, has it changed? Maybe a little bit, but fundamentally people still feel, regardless of everything that's changed, the overwhelming sense is that restrictions should still be in place. Part of this could be that people are more confused now. There's less clarity. Okay, is it marginal? Do you know? it's definitely a trend that we've seen week on week, and people are getting sort of less clear about what they can and what they cannot do. It's not surprising given the amount of change that's been going on. That's where people are going. We also asked about people how they feel when they're going out, and actually over this time, people haven't been following the social distancing guidelines, or in fact, sorry, rather, that's been getting, people were originally in June, but they're not so much now. In fact, that's had an impact on people's enjoyment of going outside. So we're seeing there's less social distancing, finding it more difficult. It's probably a more complicated world out there as well. This is a question: are we being too paranoid or not paranoid enough? This is a question that has been, I feel it's been a valid question almost from the very start. And in fact, my son, back in February, we were talking about him. He was saying, yeah, this is the question he couldn't answer for himself. Are we being too paranoid or not paranoid enough? And we ask questions again that kind of tap into this. We don't ask the question exactly in this way, but we say, you know, are we easing too much? Are we easing too quickly the restrictions, or do we need to ease them more quickly? As you can see there's an overwhelming sense really that we're probably not being paranoid enough from that measure. Second one, most people think there'll be a second peak and don't think the virus will go away slowly. So again, we've got people, there's genuinely some fear there that the virus is coming back and we're doing things too quickly. And the final one that talks about this is really about, and we've just started looking into this, which is, you know, I support the need for further lockdowns, or actually we just can't keep going on like this. And so, but the majority here is that there is support is needed. Very sorry, I support the need for further lockdowns is coming out on top. So I think in general, what we're seeing is that people are feeling probably not being paranoid enough at the moment. So what else is going on? What else is going on? There's obviously some threats to the economy, and this has been consistent right from the very start. Most people, it's been sitting between 66 and 70% of people believe, expect, anticipate we're heading for a massive recession. And if there's a recession, you know, again, more than 40% consistently think their personal financial situation is going to be massively affected. In fact, we've seen that increase slowly over the period as well. So more people are thinking, well, actually, you know, on reflection, I'm going to be personally impacted by this recession. And finally, and I've put in a midpoint here at the beginning of July because there was a bit of a fluctuation. We ask a question about whether people think the government should be focusing on saving lives or getting the economy working again. And we are, it's always been in favour of saving lives over the economy. There was a period in the middle where people were thinking more about the economy, but what we've seen is this swing back again to people thinking actually we need to be concentrating on lives. So much of these stats are saying actually we're not really moving forward so much, and in fact what we're doing is you know, we're almost swinging back a little bit to kind of the fears at the start, almost at the start of the pandemic. So these combination of fears are leading to an increase in the sense that people are feeling on edge and that their life is out of control. In fact, from June to now, we've seen a substantial swing towards people feeling, actually, do you know what, things aren't so great. That's where this combination of fears has led us. And finally, I think, really on just a quick update on coronavirus, we ask a very specific question. So in the event of a recession, and we ask this of all 2,000 people, so we researched 2,000 members of the general public, it's a representative sample, we do it on a weekly basis. And typically about 1,100 of those are active charity financial supporters. And so we're able to look at how different charity supporters are responding. But this particular question asks of regular givers whether about their intentions to cancel any charitable donations. And intentions is a very strong indicator of likely behaviour. And you know, I really wish it was different. The good news on this slide is that there is, you know, nearly 50% of respondents who are active regular givers say not in a million years, although the overall net has reduced, but we are seeing a consistent 20%, that's 1 in 5, saying, I plan to do this. And I think what everything's screaming out at the moment is, what can you do to prevent 1 in 5 regular givers from cancelling their support? I mean, this is why we've called this a webinar, the retention imperative. This isn't a coronavirus, a COVID-19, what's going on. It's not a webinar presentation about that. But we can't talk about retention without understanding just what's happening out there. And actually, this is the clearest. This is the clearest message to me, really, that there could be some difficult times ahead. Accepting that people don't always do what they say they're going to do, but even so, 1 in 5 at the moment of active regular givers saying they plan to stop any charitable donations they're giving if there's a recession. So it's kind of scary times. So the context for us here is all about, and it has been, so Roger and I have been, and a number of charities, we've been talking about this right since the start of the pandemic. The question is, right now, what's the best things we can do really to kind of protect charity financial support, charity support, what can we do to make sure that those regular givers are staying with us. So that's a really important part of the context. Any questions on coronavirus and COVID-19? Stick them on the Q&A. I think some people are already, and we can either deal with those live or we can pick them up at the end. But really, that was an introduction to show really how COVID-19 is amplifying and making it even more urgent that we need to focus on retention. Okay, so I'm going to put on my a different hat now. I'm going to take off my coronavirus.
Richard, do you mind if I just interrupt, just simply because we've got a clarification question in the chat, which is completely relevant to the COVID-19. So I just thought it might be the best time to ask it. It's basically just, can you give a very quick reminder of who the survey is it goes out to and who's included in the research?
Certainly, yes. So it's a weekly. It goes out weekly, and the field work starts on a Thursday, finishes on a Sunday. We research 2,000 members of the public, and it's a representative of the UK public. It's a representative sample, so there's a quota by age, gender, region to make sure that we've got a good distribution. It's a fairly long questionnaire, fairly long survey. When we gather all the data back on a Monday, Tuesday, and really translate that through into the analysis, which will then make available. There's also we do a weekly video diaries as well. So there's some selection of families and people who are really just sharing their lived experience with COVID-19 to bring to life some of the data that we've got there. So yeah, so that's 2,000. We get 2,000 total responses from that research.
Thank you, Richard. And I'm just also getting feedback. A couple of people are saying there's some background noise. We've done everything we can. I'm really sorry about that. We will keep the two of us that aren't talking, we'll keep muted as we go through. But I'm just an apology to everyone for the background noise that some people are getting.
Okay, I shall lean forwards and speak up. Apologies if that makes my face too big in the screen, if you can see it. Okay, right then, moving on. Some reflections, quite bizarrely perhaps, on agricultural techniques. I assume you're all ready for this and prepared for some farming news. There we go. Here's a picture of a field. But this is really all about my time at the RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. I mean, I think the B in RSPB probably should be biodiversity, given the impacts that the RSPB has. And I just want to talk a little bit about agriculture and farming. Now, you may not know, but agricultural land makes up about 70 to 75% of the land area in England alone. And more than 23 million acres, that is more than 23 million acres, or 9 million hectares, it's quite a lot. And over a third of that looks like this picture. Well, it's arable farming, which could look a little bit like that picture. And obviously, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, or biodiversity, is very, very interested in conserving species of birds and biodiversity and butterflies and bees and lots of other things beginning with B. And because it's interested in that, it's obviously going to be very interested in looking after farmland, which takes up nearly 3/4 of England. And through its monitoring work, the RSPB has observed that biodiversity on farmland basically crashed over recent decades, just collapsed. So I guess it's an environmental crisis in the UK. And so one of the RSPB's priorities relates to farmland and influencing farmland and how farmland contributes to biodiversity. It is very difficult though, because of course, if you're a farmer, you're going to be strongly incentivized to get as much food, as much profit out of every last square metre of every acre you're responsible for managing, and that's completely understandable. For many years, the RSPB tried to persuade farmers not to use pesticides, not to use, to not use pesticides, to leave margins at the sides of fields, to keep hedgerows, to plant more hedgerows for wildlife, and make room for wildlife. It's kind of the RSPB's attempting to do this for farming in the UK. But as you can imagine, the short-term effect of trying to do these things on a farm will be to reduce yield and profit. So if you don't use pesticides and you start putting hedgerows in, you're reducing the amount of farm that can make food. But the RSPB had a strong hunch and some anecdotal evidence that even after a short period of time, biodiversity would be restored to farmland, which would improve yield and profit if it was to farm in a different way. And then, of course, if you imagine, it would be many, many more benefits beyond of a rich and vibrant countryside. Obviously, and understandably, the farmers weren't receptive. Not all of them, but many farmers were not receptive and continued in a lot of places to operate sort of more industrial farming practices. That's kind of where things were sort of about 20 years ago. So the RSPB decided to take a different approach. And in the year 2000, it decided to buy a farm just west of Cambridge called Hope Farm. It's about 180 hectares, reasonable sized farm. And it was bought, interestingly, through a cash appeal, and RSPB supporters were very generous in responding to this. And it's a tangible story, and obviously with hope. So what was the RSPB going to do with this farm? Right, what it did was ensure, its main objectives were to ensure that they're called the big three, but three conditions need to be in place. And ultimately, the farm would appear like this, as opposed to the previous picture that I showed. The three are, certainly for birds, it's giving them a safe place to nest. It's food in spring and summer for their young, and it's food and shelter over winter. And these are all provided by providing extra wild spaces and not over exploiting the land that's there. So these are simple approaches. And of course, it's terribly important that they're measured, that there's enough of them, and that it's provided. And in some respects, it's obvious. Seeing land as an integral part of the environment, sort of holistically, and not just an asset simply to be used for industrial production of food crops. It's part and parcel of our environment. And I'm sure that many of you here are aware and understand this fully. So what did happen? What happened for the RSPB at Hope Farm? Well, they saw results immediately, and this is great because this is a chart, and we all love charts. Well, Roger, Chris, and myself do. And the blue line shows kind of the blue line is essentially the control. That's what the rest of the country did, and the red line is what happened to biodiversity at the farm that the RSPB was managing. There were immediate impacts from the first year, and they continued to grow. There was large growth in birds, large growth in butterflies, just large growth generally in biodiversity, but most importantly, also a secure bottom line. There's another B there, RSPB. So this approach was looking after the biodiversity and the bottom line. I think this is a great case study for so many reasons. It's about the environment, it's about great tangible supporters, it's about outputs and outcomes, it's science, there's a lot in there as a package, it's wonderful. But for me, I particularly like it because for me, it's a great analogy for growing support as opposed to growing crops, as in there are different ways to grow crops and there are different ways to grow support for charity. So the two things, I guess, are: do you grow support at the expense of your supporters and treat them like an asset, or do you grow them in harmony and actually treat them holistically and understand their broader environment and their context, and really getting the myriad benefits that come with that? And so for me, there's some really interesting parallels with that. And I want to just come back to the beginning again, if you like. So I did work at the RSPB for quite a long time. And I have to say that through that period, when Hope Farm was doing such a good job at bringing biodiversity back, I probably oversaw some fundraising operations that didn't do enough thanking, that probably was squeezing in as many asks as possible in a calendar year, and actually as a result ended up with too much attrition. And you know, it's often difficult to get away from focusing on bringing in the cash. It's often very difficult to do that and getting drawn down that kind of industrial approach. And in fact, I think probably most of the people here today, because you're here today, are not probably not doing this. But it's still something that's very much not expected, but often it's often an unwritten expectation. So that's in the background. But also what we've got is this new kind of elephant in the room, the monster on the horizon, this expectation that if there's a recession, charities supporters will cancel their donation. So what can we do? Well, you may have seen this before, but if there is an impending attrition crisis, and Roger's already alluded to it, but we would say, and we will say, actually the solution is to grow loyalty. And it's that feeling of support or allegiance to a cause or charity. So if we're facing this attrition crisis, we absolutely need to be focusing on loyalty. And that loyalty is that kind of holistic farming of our supporters. It's that whole big picture. But in this instance, our big three are commitment, satisfaction, and trust. Those are the things that we need to be putting in place to nurture our supporters in the most powerful way. And of course, like Hope Farm, we've also got a chart where we can show through our work, if you grow loyalty along the bottom axis there, so as you go along, you increase loyalty, you increase retention, and the likelihood of somebody continuing to make their financial gift goes up. So we've got that evidence, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this graph a bit later on, but now I want to hand over to Chris Keating, who is going to tell us how at the NDCS, the National Deaf Children's Society, they started measuring and influencing loyalty specifically to improve retention. So I'm just now going to hand over to Chris.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. So yes, great to be here, and I'd love to tell you a bit more about how NDCS has used About Loyalty's Chase Index to fit into the work that we're doing to improve our supporter journey. One moment. First, a bit of context. So we're the National Deaf Children's Society. We are the UK's leading charity to support deaf children and their families. We work to break down the barriers that deaf children face, and we believe that a deaf child can achieve anything that a hearing child can, so long as they get the right support. Now, a few things about our cause and our brand that affect our fundraising program. There are about 50,000 deaf children in the UK. It's a cause that many people, well, most people don't have a personal experience of because of those numbers. We're also a charity that doesn't have the highest brand awareness compared to some other charities within the sector. However, we've been able to consistently grow our individual giving program. You've probably been in training sessions or conferences where somebody's put a graph up showing income going like that over time if you consistently invest in fundraising. And to be honest, that's exactly what NDCS's income looks like over the last 15 years. And that has been heavily driven through using face-to-face fundraising. Which creates, which defines the challenge for me as head of supporter retention and for our everybody who's working on our donor journey, our supporter experience, and loyalty. Normally at this point, I would have a graph of, whoops. One moment. That's the right slide. Good. Normally, I'd have a leaky bucket at this point, but you've already seen the leaky bucket. So instead, we have somebody else. Who knows who this is? Please type in the chat. if you know who it is. Let's see how this works. This will work brilliantly in a live environment. Does it work at all in an online environment? No. Right, okay. This is Sisyphus. He is a Greek titan. He offended the gods and was doomed to spend eternity rolling a rock up a cliff, eternally recruiting new supporters because the new supporters he'd found last year had cancelled. And that very much is the business problem we face, how to build the strongest possible relationships with the supporters we recruit to keep them giving so that the program keeps growing rather than simply recruiting people to fill the gaps left by the people who signed up last year and since cancelled. How does about loyalty fit into this? So Roger and Richard run a project where charities who participate in a consortium do consistent year-on-year surveys of their supporters to measure their loyalty. Now, if you recall Richard's slide a couple of slides ago, this is really important because we know that people with the highest loyalty scores are the most likely to keep giving, the most likely to upgrade, the most likely to leave gifts in their wills. And these were our results from when we first participated in this project in 2018. You can see there are three components to the loyalty score. There's commitment, satisfaction, and trust, which taken together work through into an overall loyalty score. And these are our results. And some of you are probably thinking, Chris, why are you sharing this? Because it shows your charity being below average. Why on earth do that in a public forum? Because it's true and it's useful. What did we learn? So, we learned that our supporters have a below average commitment score, but satisfaction and trust are closer to, they're not exactly at, average. This is not a huge surprise to us. Talking to the other charities in the consortium, children's charities on the whole tended to have lower commitment scores. You might say that this is because British people care about, for instance, animals more than they care about children. You also might observe that our fundraising is heavily driven by face-to-face, and that is a channel which is heavily driven by somebody has a conversation with a fundraiser, then they agree to sign up, and you're finding people who don't necessarily have the strongest connection to the cause. So this was not the greatest surprise to us. The question is, what can we do about that, and how do we improve the level of commitment and satisfaction and trust that our supporters have? Another interesting thing we found is that segmentation was not terribly helpful. So I am a direct marketer. My instinctive answer to every question is, where are the segments and what can we do with them? Actually, we found that this pattern was broadly true across all of the segments that we had on our database. It wasn't that we had one group of supporters over here who were immensely committed and loyal, and another over here who were very disloyal. Or at least we have no way to predict how that would work given our database. Of course, we know there are factors that affect how likely somebody is to continue to give, including their age, their demographics, and how long they've been giving already. But loyalty is another factor that feeds into that. So we had many questions. I've already touched on, with some of us due to our cause, some of it due to our brand. What in this picture is driven by our channels, what's driven in our communications. And when you think about what builds loyalty, I think Richard's going to come to talk in a bit more detail about what the drivers of commitment and satisfaction and trust are likely to be. But it's something that's affected by every single interaction that your supporter has had with your organization. And not just your organization either. It's affected by every experience that a supporter has that's related to your cause. There are things you can control, like the quality of the communications you send out. There are things you can't control, like what experience somebody has had of childhood deafness. So the more we looked at this and the more we thought, okay, what drives commitment? What drives satisfaction? What drives trust? And what can we do about it? The more we thought, okay, well, here's this other factor over here. Is that going to be important? What is the thing that we need to focus on? Which left me feeling slightly like this. This is somebody called Professor Butts. He has a self-operating napkin. If you look at A, there's a soup spoon. And if you look just to the right of that, there's a feather duster, possibly a napkin. And the idea is that if he raises the soup spoon to his lips, then the napkin will automatically come and wipe his chin. Because the soup spoon will pull a cord, B, which then jerks a ladle, C, which throws the cracker, D, past the toucan, which then jumps off the cracker in its perch tilts, upsetting some seeds into a pail. And we're left going, okay, where is the toucan in our supporter experience? And then we started thinking, okay, what are the levers that we can pull that are likely to affect supporter experience and therefore loyalty? How can we build our communications and our touch points to do this in the best possible way? I mean, in an ideal world, you would have a fundraising department with great stewardship, great thanking, relevant and interesting asks, prompt and reliable customer service, consistent set of propositions and messages that based on a sound understanding of why people support you and what they get out of doing that. What's the emotional commitment of, what's the emotional reward of giving to a charity? And we had some of this picture already. We had insight work looking at which stories we could tell that had the greatest resonance. And that's kind of, so these findings fitted into a picture that we were already building of how to move supporter experience onwards. Now, I'd like to think about, like to share with you one communication that we sent and which drivers of loyalty it might be affecting. Before we do that though, Richard, it'd probably be helpful if you could talk a bit more about what the factors behind commitment and satisfaction and trust are before we do that.
Absolutely. So without going into vast amounts of detail, because it's a fairly intensive approach, commitment is very much about somebody's passion for the cause. It's around my commitment to the relationship, my passion for the work, and it really does get across that sense of how much I'm absolutely impassioned about the work and the objectives and the cause that your charity exists to address. The other thing that drives commitment is personal connection. So whilst, and that's the sense that I feel associated in some way with the issues that your beneficiaries are facing, and it may be that I'm personally affected myself or somebody who's close to me. But that in itself isn't the driver of loyalty, but is one of the drivers of commitment. As is the sense of risk. So when we talk about risk, it's the idea that if I withdraw my support, then actually then something bad might come about from there, and that actually increases. It's very closely connected to impact, and understanding that I can see the difference that my donation makes, and by taking that away or by withdrawing my support, I could recognise the negative impact that would have. So it's kind of it's the complement, and it's the complement to those positive, passionate commitment drivers. So that's what sits behind commitment. Behind satisfaction, it is very much about the experience for me, how the experience is working for me. So I'm feeling thanked appropriately. I think the communications work effectively, and I think critically, there's another one which looks at how well the communications have raised my awareness of the issues. And so there's a connection with satisfaction around impact as well. So my satisfaction goes up if I'm also gaining insight and understanding into the issues, and so that's achieved through very similar communications around impact. So that kind of sums up satisfaction. Now for trust, yes, absolutely. It's you could sum it up with I trust this charity. I trust this charity is going to spend its money wisely, that it's making good decisions, and again, another link into impact here is around perceived performance. So I think that the way the charity works is effective. I think it's effective at delivering its outcomes for the beneficiaries that it promises. I believe that it's effective at achieving its mission. So it's all around making the right decisions, spending donations wisely, and being good at achieving those outcomes. So those would be some of the drivers that sit behind trust. Okay, Chris, back to you.
Cool, thank you. So, I'll share with you this video. Now, as we look at it, it'd be great if you could think about which aspects of commitment and satisfaction and trust that you think it might be affecting. Is it, for instance, driving personal connection? Is it talking about impact and perceived performance? Does it give people warm, fluffy feelings? Let's have a look at it and see what you think. Then I will share with you what our opinion was. One moment.
Look in there.
My name's Megan. I'm 5 years old.
I'm Sherry, I'm mum to Megan and she's profoundly deaf. Megan was diagnosed at 2 weeks old. To us that was a huge shock. We didn't know anybody that was deaf, we didn't have any experience of deafness, and it was the complete unknown. It was a whole mix of emotions, everything hit you at once. The questions of would she be able to talk, what can she hear, because we still didn't know exactly. I knew nothing about deafness. The National Deaf Children's Society has helped us most with the information, but there's also somebody to help at the end of the phone. They're very friendly, and it's just knowing that there's a person who has the answers there to provide you the support when you need it. Megan's first words was just after she was 1, which was "mummy," which was a really good victory for me. That was amazing. It was really, really good. It was just unexpected as well. She was just in her pushchair and she just looked up and said, "Mummy." And it was sort of overwhelming because we didn't know it was coming and we'd been working towards her first words for such a long time. And also it gives you a little bit of hope. It was really hard to decide for Megan to have cochlear implants. It's a big operation, so we spent a really long time reading all the information we could. Straight after Megan had her operation, she came round and she had these huge bandages on her head. She was swollen and you kind of really hoped you'd done the right thing at that point. But just to see her smiling and eating biscuits within about an hour, she was back to herself quite quickly, which was really nice. From then on, she's come on leaps and bounds. Her speech really started developing, her personality came out even more. Megan has no barriers now. She can do whatever she wants to do. She has tons of ambition. When she wants to do something, she does it. Just know she's going to use her confidence. We would just like to say a really big thank you to the supporters that donate to the charity. They are helping lots of children like Megan. This information that the charity provide and support is really beneficial, and it helps you when you're having a really difficult time and you don't know the answers yourself. Is that true?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you wave to the cameras like this? And can you say thank you? Thank you for supporting us.
Great. So I hope you had a chance to think about which drivers of loyalty you thought that video might increase and what feelings it might inspire in the recipients. Aha, got a couple of people commenting in the chat. It seems to be possible to send a chat message that reaches the panelists, but not everybody else. So please do have a look. So we've got some people saying all the aspects of commitment, satisfaction, trust. We have one person saying don't think it dealt with trust. Some people saying commitment, some people saying satisfaction, which fits nicely with my slides, because actually I think this one communication deals with all three. So firstly, we're telling a personal story. Storytelling obviously is at the heart of effective fundraising. Most people will not know a deaf child or a parent of a deaf child. But what stories do is act as the way people build emotional connection with something that's outside of their experience. If you look at the science of storytelling, that is 100% what a story exists to do. It's actually something that, at least there's a theory that stories have evolved for precisely that purpose, so that your tribe of hunter-gatherers can share information about morality and about understanding other people, and that's what a story does. So by relating to that story, people will start to put themselves in the shoes of a deaf child and a deaf parent of a deaf child, which will make them care more about the cause. It will create a sense of connection. And in those ways, those are some of the factors that underlie commitment, hence loyalty. Other factors that dealt with satisfaction that Richard touched on were increasing knowledge and making people feel appropriately thanked. And I feel that this does those things. And also, an element of trust is demonstrating the impact of what you do and the risk of what might not happen if people stopped giving. Now, there's a point being made in the chat, but I don't think this deals with trust because it doesn't really talk about what we spend our money on, which I think is a perfectly justified point. This is not this does not go into any particular detail about our services, but we believe it's right for our audience and gives them the kind of connection that they want to have with our charity. So I think that touches on all three. Let me just check if there's anything else in the Q&A or the chat that is worth responding to. Yeah, somebody else has just said that it builds trust because they see real impact on a real family. Yes, I think that's a really important point. The way that most donors understand impact is not that they read your annual report and accounts and see that you've spent lots of money on highly cost-effective projects, the way they understand impact is to know that there are real people out there who have been helped in real and meaningful ways. And that's what our impact is. Cool. So that was the next stage of our thought process. It was, okay, this is all complicated and there's too many factors, but equally, some individual bits of good practice in one specific communication will have a really big, well, some specific bits of good practice in one specific communication can make some impact across several different aspects of loyalty. Which ties into my next point. It's not one big thing. It's not even one project. You can't say, okay, we're doing a loyalty project, and then, okay, 6 months later, we've spent £50,000 on agency fees, we've done some new communications, and problem solved. It is a case of trying to make improvements to as many touch points as we possibly can. What have we been doing? The fundamental underpinning point of this is focusing on our supporters' needs and how giving fulfills them. Supported by research into what stories we can tell and how people respond to them in an emotional way. How have we done that in more specific terms? So we have a direct mail and telephone-led welcome journey for a new supporter who signs up. We've been rewriting all of those. We've been auditing the thank yous that we sent to anybody who's making any kind of contribution. We've introduced an email survey to the people who sign up as new supporters through face-to-face fundraising. Been increasing the amount of video communications that we send in our supporter journey. For a long while, that one I just shared was our only one, but now we have more. Doing things like sending Christmas cards to some of our top supporters, conducting feedback surveys on our supporter care emails. So just to give you some specifics, this is part of, this is just the text of a previous edition of our welcome pack. This is a new version. Notice it's the same case study, little girl called Jessica, in both versions of the pack. I just want to touch on some of the aspects of copy that we have changed to tighten this up. Top is old, bottom is newer. So first version opened with, Chris, this is the moment you transform deaf children's lives. By setting up my direct debit for £10 a month or what have you, I've been transforming deaf children's lives. Great. Second version, thank you for showing you care about deaf children like Jessica. So why make that change? Firstly, because somebody who signs up to a direct debit and then receives the welcome pack through the post a couple of weeks later, nice to know that they're transforming deaf children's lives, but do we really, do they really know how we're doing that, how their support is helping, and what role they're playing? Second version, thank you for showing you care about deaf children like Jessica. It's thanking somebody for who they are rather than what they have done, which is, I don't know how many people here pay attention to what Jen Shang and Adrian Sargent are saying about relationship fundraising 3.0 and the role that identity has to play in donor experience. That's essentially the insight from that, is that thanking somebody for who they are is more powerful than thanking them for what they have done. Another slight tweak in the copy. So thanks to you, we'll support families through the overwhelming moment they find out their child is deaf, which is how most charities would normally put it. Then in the second version, focusing more on what the supporter specifically is doing. You'll give deaf children the happy, confident childhood they deserve. So taking the charity out of the equation and focusing on what the supporter specifically is doing. Building that direct connection between the supporter and the impact of their gift. Here's another change, some reactivation copy, which, because we're running out of time, I will skip through. Just talk very briefly about our new donor feedback survey. So we were hoping that this would get us a picture of what is it really about face-to-face interactions that really matters. I saw a blog post from a face-to-face agency saying fundraisers scored 9.8 out of 10 when the donor was asked to rate their professionalism and politeness during the welcome call. Great, which is fine. Is that really driving loyalty, though? I'll quickly note that surveying tens of thousands of new face-to-face fundraisers gave us a really good unexpected benefit of tons of unexpected positive feedback from people who've just signed up and really loved the person that they spoke to. And by asking different variants of questions, we found that there was this recipe to direct dialogue fundraiser interactions. Not putting people under pressure, fundraisers being clear that people were signing up to a monthly direct debit, people who were passionate about the cause. Those turned out to be the key drivers of whether somebody who just signed up intended to continue giving. So, apologies for that whistle-stop tour. I'll now hand back over to Richard.
Thank you, Chris. So very quickly now, I would like to say thank you again. That's absolutely brilliant, and I would like to see more of what MDCS has been doing, particularly under your leadership there. Just want to do a very, very quick piece on why growing loyalty is a commercial imperative. It makes sense from a business perspective. Showed you this chart before, but I've got some axes on it now. So you can see that only a small increase in loyalty could have quite a big impact on retention. So we're talking about quite a powerful lever, loyalty. As I know Chris is going to come on to show you what they've done with loyalty. And of course, if you're looking at just a small increase in loyalty, maybe 0.1, 0.2, then there could give you up to 5% increase on that y-axis. And an improvement in retention of 5% just on some simple maths using a baseline of, say, 25,000 supporters, each giving £50 a year. Cumulatively over 5 years, it's approaching an extra £1 million, which is something we would all say yes to. And actually, fundamentally, as Chris has outlined, these are the three things: you understand and build and grow, commitment, satisfaction, and trust. And those are the kind of rewards that you can get. I'm now going to give it straight back to Chris to say what to expect for him to explain the difference that all of the things he's talked about and the difference that they have made.
Chris, before you kick off, can I just come in? I know we're going to lose some people because it is 4 o'clock. I know we are going to lose some people. If you are able to stay with us, please do, because we're just going to sort of pull this together, and we will have an opportunity to ask some questions and answers. If you do need to go, that's absolutely fine. The session is being recorded, so if you need to go and still want to see the last 10 minutes or so, then do feel free to go in and have a look at it. In that way, but apologies, we're slightly overrunning, but I hope you'll bear with us, because I think the content of what Chris is talking about is really interesting and valuable.
Cool. Richard, I think I am relying on your slides still. No worries, I think I'm there. So, right. What was the impact? So, some year-on-year figures. Participating in the Chase Index in 2018 and 2019. You will be pleased to see, well, I was pleased to see, that all of commitment and satisfaction and trust went up year on year. So good to see that happening, particularly given the amount of effort that we'd put in to attempting to drive loyalty forwards. Does this make a financial impact? Yes, it certainly does make a financial impact. I wish I could give you a nice, clear-cut, simple answer about how much money this is all worth. However, anybody who has ever attempted to really dig into comparisons of direct debit, attrition, and profitability will know it's not a simple question to answer. What we can say is that our attrition rates are down between 5 and 15%, depending on which bit, which segment by tenure or age or what have you you're looking at. We know that there is a bigger picture to that than simply these scores, because of issues to do with tenure and demographics as well. However, we believe that improving loyalty has been a significant factor in doing that. And a 1% fall in the attrition of new supporters to us is worth at least £100,000 in long-term income. So this is something that has a really significant financial impact for the long term. Great. Possibly at this point, I should hand back over to Richard and Roger to talk through questions. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Chris. Yeah, that was great. There was so much content in there. I know we rushed you a little bit at the end there, so apologies for that, and apologies to everyone watching who sort of would probably have liked a bit more detail on there, but that was really great. There's been some really interesting both questions put in the Q&A and in the chat, and also sort of a discussion in the chat. I'm going to start off, there were some practical ones to start with. We started talking very early on about thoughts on the appeals program and some thoughts on maybe there were too many appeals and things like that. Do you have a view for your supporters of what's too many, what's too much for people to receive? And I guess it's going to be different for different segments. But do you have a way of tackling that at NDCS?
We think we're fairly far away from too much. So our committed givers will receive at least 4 newsletters. They might receive an appeal or 2. If they've opted into emails, they will receive at least 1 email a month. But we think when we test sending these specific communications versus not sending them always turns out to be the right answer. So I think we're confident that the communications are relevant enough, and the people are sufficiently in control of their own preferences that we're not worried about sending too much at the moment. It probably helps that because this is a direct debit file, most of the communications are stewardship, and the number of asks is a relatively low proportion of that.
And I think that's an important point. It is about the balance, isn't it? It's about the entirety of the relationship. We were talking a little bit in the chat, which you probably didn't have a chance to follow. I'm sure you didn't. And David from Woodland Trust made a point there about your video, and there was sort of that one video on its own can't do everything, but then there is also, so it is about the balance of communications, but then there's also the peak end rule that shows that some things stand out more than others, and if you can create those peaks of emotion, whether it's positive or ideally positive for you, then then you've got the ability for some communications to really have the power to do that. But overall, it is about the balance of communications in there. So I think your point about the balance of asks and feedback is absolutely right in there. We've got oh gosh, it's going through far too fast. I might just scroll down my screen. Anne asked if we could just quickly, on screen, Richard, go back to the third example of changed tone in communications, because she's fascinated by that. So I wonder if you can sort of scroll back to that while I just ask Chris a different question, which I think is around, obviously a lot of your supporters are face-to-face supporters. Are you seeing that with face-to-face supporters, commitment is lower than supporters from other channels, and does that affect what you're thinking, or do you think the rules apply as much for face-to-face supporters as they do for every supporter?
So the question is, do face-to-face supporters have lower commitment, and do the same things apply to them? I mean, I believe yes on the whole. Like, looking at the whole consortium that's taking part in this project, it's quite noticeable that the charities who have the largest face-to-face programs are lower down on the commitment score. I mean, it's also worth pointing out that, like, the scale on those diagrams is between 5.2 and 5.7 or something. So it's not a vast difference, but it is a noticeable difference. Does that affect how we steward them? Yes, because it means that the relationship that our face-to-face recruited supporters have with us is quite likely to be very different than somebody who, to take, let's say, a cancer charity, where almost certainly giving is motivated by the fact that that donor knows somebody who has lived with or died from cancer. So that's a very fundamental point dealing with our messaging and the motivations that what we're saying is responding to. So I think the answer in all cases to say, well, what motivations are important to these donors, and then respond to them. The motivations that a lower commitment supporter is responding to are probably less specific and less rooted in personal experience of the cause. Probably quite a long answer to what sounded like quite a simple question.
Well, I paraphrased the question as well, so apologies to the person who asked it if I paraphrased it incorrectly. But I think there, what you're saying behind that is it's not purely and simply about levels of commitment, satisfaction, and trust. It's actually about trying to understand the individual drivers that different supporters will have, and you're saying there that your face-to-face supporters, as a group, on average, might have a different set of drivers and motivators, because they've come in you've reached them in a different way to other supporters that might have come to you more proactively.
Yep.
Yep.
So I think Anne is saying in the chat, could we look at this example, assuming that that's not wasting people's time? I'd be happy to. So this is actually a thank you letter for Reactivation telephone campaign. And this is the before version. And what you'll notice is it's quite a lot talking about impact. Surely talking about impact is the right answer. Well, it's talking about what the organization does, and it's not talking about the donor as a person. So if you could click forward to the next one, Richard. What we've done with that is taking out the thank you for your money, which we'll spend on our services, which are wonderful, and introducing within the space of 3 sentences there, storytelling and emotional connection, and making the language more positive and leaving the newly reactivated supporter with a more positive feeling about what's the emotional impact that me restarting this direct debit has had on an actual person, rather than a charity that says they're spending some money on something.
That links so well in with there's been a really interesting, I mentioned it before, a conversation in the chat, and it's sort of, I'm going to oversimplify it by it by sort of summarising it as stories versus stats in terms of talking about what you do, which is not doing it justice at all in there. But I think what you've illustrated there is in the first instance, you are talking about impact because you're talking about what's happened with your money, and we've done X project and X programs and reached so many people and things like that. And that is one way to certainly reassure people that you're spending their money in the right way. But actually what people are really interested in, and Richard mentioned this, that when they can see the performance and the impact that you have, that's actually by far the most effective way of growing trust, more than we spend your money wisely. And your video, I thought, pulled that out extraordinarily well in terms of just showing that the impact and the first words, and she talked about the phrases like "you've given me hope" and things like that. That's the impact that donors want to have, and that's where, if we can get supporters to be having that conversation with us about what's the difference you're making in people's lives, rather than what percentage of your money do you spend on admin or what's your CEO salary, then that's a massive win for us all, because that's what supporters actually care about more than anything. I'm going to come to another question here because it links back to the slightly different thing. You were talking about the work that you've done with Adrian and Jen and around identity, and it was just a question here around the extent to which you've been able. And I know this is very new for you, so you may not have got there yet. It may be sort of on the work plan, but it's whether yet you've been able to sort of test some of that in the wording of your communications and your appeals, and have you been able to do that yet, or is that still to come?
In progress and still to come. We're looking at how this works in some of our telemarketing scripts and trying some tests around that at the moment. So it's
right.
Working out what kind of person are our supporters, how does giving to us relate to their identity, and what identity can they grow into as they become a supporter of the National Deaf Children's Society.
That sounds like another session in a little while, Chris.
Could be.
Excellent. I'm going to pull this to a close with just the last question, which was actually the very first question that someone asked, and they talk about the writings of Sir John Harvey Jones, who was back in the day the chairman of what was ICI Chemicals, and his observation that people are rarely neutral. And it was I thought about that again when you were talking about the fact that we were talking about tribes of hunter-gatherers in there. And I think before I hand it over, Chris, I think we certainly, I'd agree with that. People are very rarely neutral, and the concept of social groups, that we all, that sense of belonging and identity in a slightly different way, but related to what you're talking about there. Identities are incredibly important. Does that link into what you've just been talking about with Adrian and Jen, or do you think that's taking us in another route again?
I have to say I'm not really familiar with this. People are really neutral. I mean, yeah. People obviously are very complicated and come to supporting a charity with a whole load of different experiences. And I think that's probably the starting point for us as fundraisers.
I took it to be thinking about the concept of social groups, and when we were hunter-gatherers, our social group was the people around us, and that we were very much part of that. Today, our social groups or our social identities are formed by, well, to a large extent, they're driven by those social media sort of routes that we're put into, aren't we? And I mean, we see in the States that there are fewer undecided voters in America than they've ever had, because people have put themselves into these identity groups, and if you say things that contradict with the identity groups that they feel parts of, that can cause massive sort of stress and conflict. Gosh, I might be going off a complete tangent here, and this might be a little window into the sorts of conversations you and I have, Chris, which maybe they should stay behind closed doors rather than in front of a couple of hundred people. And I'm finding it difficult to frame a question for you as well. But I guess the question...
That wasn't so much a question as a comment.
I think it probably was. Shall we park it there? I'm going
if
to...
anybody, sorry, I just want to say, if anybody wants to follow up on anything that I was saying that I didn't have time to really get into, please do stalk me on LinkedIn or Twitter or both. I am happy to talk about these subjects endlessly.
And I do recommend that, because he does talk about them endlessly, but he does talk about them really interestingly endlessly. And that there's you will see, if you do find Chris in that way, you will see genuinely useful and valuable content. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris, massively for this afternoon and for that offer to sort of follow up as well through those channels if people do contact you. We've still got quite a few left here still, actually, so delighted by that. We just wanted to wrap up by sort of putting a couple of dates in your diary to look forward to. Our next webinar, we're going to explore a little bit more detail the concepts of commitment, satisfaction and trust that you've heard talk about today. And we'll be having... We'll be sharing a bit more of our research and also showing some practical tips from some people that we know are doing this and doing it well. So a date for your diary there. And the second date for your diary is in November. This will be our fourth loyalty day that Rich and I run, or About Loyalty runs, on the 26th of November. It's a day where we just focus purely on growing loyalty. So all the issues we've talked about today and go into more detail. Again, we'll have some research. We've got guest speakers. We'll have some case studies to share, lots of tips and ideas, and hopefully a bit of fun as well there. So again, just date for your diary, 26th of November, Loyalty Day. And as I said, focusing entirely on tips and practical advice for growing the loyalty of your supporters. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Again, apologies we've overrun a little bit, but I hope for those of you that have stayed with us, and there's quite a number, thank you so much for doing that. Hope it's been valuable. If you've got any questions, find Chris or to either myself or Richard, again, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or you've got our contact details here. Just want to say a massive thank you for joining us, and one last thank you again for Chris for giving up his time this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for coming.